The fog off the Seine had a way of muffling even the loudest footsteps, swallowing the sounds of Paris until only the hiss of lantern gas and the faint slap of water against the quay remained. Somewhere beyond, invisible in the pale morning mist, a tugboat groaned against the current, its whistle echoing across the river like a melancholy horn. Inside the Shuttered hotel on Rue des Écoles, where the curtains were drawn against the day and dust had settled over forgotten furniture, a man's body floated in a tub filled with stagnant water, his hand curled around the stub of a pencil. The words on the damp page nearby had blurred into illegible streaks. Some said he had been a poet of modest renown, others a lunatic who scribbled verses no one read. To Maigret, summoned from Quai des Orfèvres, with his heavy overcoat still damp from the river air, it was neither the words nor the water that mattered, but the silence in the room. The silence of a place that had been abandoned long before death had arrived. If you find yourself drawn into this fog-drenched case, into the alleys, cafes, and smoke-filled parlours of Paris that still cling to their mysteries, I invite you to stay with me. Subscribe, share this investigation with those who find beauty in shadows, and keep the lantern burning as we walk deeper into the enigma together. The first call had come at dawn, when Paris was still wrapped in its habitual greyness, that hour when the lamps on the quays were being extinguished one by one, and the mist rising from the Seine seemed thicker than the stone bridges themselves. Maigret had been standing at his office window in Quai des Orfèvres, pipe already burning between his teeth, when the telephone on his desk rattled with the flat insistence of bad news. He answered with the same calm grunt he gave to all calls, a sound as if he were acknowledging not the words but the weight they would bring. A voice, tired and nasal, belonged to a sergent de ville from the 5th arrondissement. A body had been found in a Shuttered hotel on Rue des Écoles, not far from the Sorbonne. The man spoke as if still half asleep, but the words body and hotel carried enough urgency to send Maigret reaching for his heavy overcoat. Outside, Paris exhaled its morning breath in plumes of damp fog. The inspector walked with his usual slow determination, his broad shoulders hunched slightly forward, hat brim shadowing his eyes. The streetcars rattled without haste, their bells muted by the mist. He knew this quarter well, students hurrying with books clutched to their chests, cafes where the air smelled of burnt coffee grounds, tobacconists opening shutters with the squeal of old hinges. Yet the hotel in question had been closed for months, perhaps longer, its facade forgotten, its windows boarded as though it wished to conceal whatever lingered inside. That, perhaps, was the first detail that pressed itself upon him, the contrast between the living city and this place arrested in silence. The sergeant de ville stood at the door, shifting uneasily in the damp air. He led Maigret inside without ceremony. The hall smelled of mildew and dust, the odour of things shut away too long. A narrow staircase, carpet eaten thin by moths, led upward. Each step creaked as if protesting intrusion. A shaft of pale light fell from a broken shutter somewhere above, revealing motes of dust drifting like slow snow. Maigret placed his hand on the banister, feeling the sticky varnish beneath his thick fingers. He climbed steadily, his pipe clenched firmly, eyes half closed as if he were already listening to the silence. On the second floor, the sergeant pushed open a door with the back of his hand. The room beyond was dim, its curtains drawn tight. The air felt heavier, thick with the scent of stagnant water. A claw-footed tub stood near the wall, filled to the brim. Floating within, face half submerged, was the body of a man. His hair, darkened by water, clung to his forehead. His left hand dangled over the rim, clutching something so tightly that the knuckles had turned white even in death. Maigret stepped closer. Between the stiff fingers was a pencil stub, the wood swollen, lead blackened by moisture. On a rickety table nearby lay a notebook, its cover warped by damp. The pages inside had run into grey smears, letters dissolving like the man himself into water and silence. A chair stood askew, one leg cracked, as though someone had knocked it aside in haste. The wallpaper peeled at the edges, revealing a darker underlayer stained with age. A lamp with a broken chimney rested in the corner, unlit, its kerosene long evaporated. The inspector filled the room with his presence, standing immovable, pipe smoke curling upward, eyes travelling slowly from one object to another. The body was clothed, though poorly. A threadbare jacket, trousers shiny at the knees, shoes scuffed until the leather seemed thin as paper. His face was narrow, with sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes now closed. The water had paled his skin to the colour of wax. Not the face of a man accustomed to comfort, Maigret thought, but not without a certain stubborn dignity, as though in life he had clung to something invisible. The sergeant shifted, clearing his throat as if to ask whether it was accident, suicide, or something darker. But Maigret gave him no answer. He was listening to the silence again, to the peculiar hush of a room long deserted, yet recently disturbed. He knew this feeling well, the strange weight of places where something irreversible had taken place. It was not what he saw, but what he sensed. The faint disorder of dust, the absence of ordinary objects, the faint odour that lingered beyond the water and mildew. A place where someone had lingered in secret. He approached the table, touched the notebook with the back of his hand. Damp. Ink smudges clung to his fingertips. He bent closer, squinting at the blurred words. Only a few remained. Legible, fragments of sentences, half lines that suggested verse. One phrase, barely decipherable, seemed to read, "Beyond the river fog." Another dissolved before his eyes, a poet's words, perhaps, or a madman's. He straightened, pipe between his lips, gaze fixed on the drowned man. "Who found him?" Maigret asked at last, his voice low, steady. "A neighbour, monsieur, the concierge from across the street. She saw light last night in a window that should have been dark. This morning, she told us. We forced the door." "Who has the key?" "No one. The place has been closed a year. Owners live in Bordeaux. No guests, no staff." Maigret's heavy brow furrowed slightly. He moved toward the door, opened it wider, and looked back at the room from the threshold. The shape of the tub, the sagging chair, the lonely table, all appeared like props on a stage awaiting interpretation. He felt the faintest shiver of anticipation, not of excitement, but of recognition. He had walked into many such rooms, each carrying its own story, hidden beneath layers of silence and dust. The question was never simply who had died, but why this death had chosen this place at this time. He signalled to the sergeant to guard the door and descended slowly. On the street, the fog had not lifted. The concierge stood across the way, arms folded, kerchief tied tightly beneath her chin, eyes sharp with curiosity and fear. She looked as though she had been waiting for him, eager to empty her store of impressions. Maigret approached with measured steps. "You saw light?" he asked. "Yes, monsieur, just a flicker. I thought perhaps squatters had broken in. But it was only for a few minutes, then darkness again. I knew something was wrong." She spoke with certainty, though her words carried the tremor of gossip. He let her talk, offering nothing more than a slow nod, pipe glowing softly. It was often in these outpourings that the tiniest thread emerged, but now he heard only the commonplace, suspicion of strangers, unease at empty buildings, the habit of watching windows. When he returned inside, he paused once more in the hall. His men would arrive soon, Lucas, perhaps Janvier, to examine, to measure, to collect. But for now it was only him and the drowned poet. He climbed again to the second floor, entered the shuttered room. The stillness had not changed. He drew the curtains a little, letting daylight filter through the slats. Dust floated in golden shafts. The face of the man in the tub seemed calmer now, as though the faint light had granted him a final recognition. Maigret stood beside him, pipe smoke mingling with the mist that crept even into the room. He imagined, without admitting it even to himself, the sound of scratching pencil, the murmur of words half-formed, the stubborn struggle to set them down before they slipped away. Then silence, water rising, pages blurring. A life ending not with violence, but with surrender. Yet why here, in this forgotten hotel, locked from the world? The inspector did not move for a long while. Outside, the city was stirring, carriages rolling, voices carrying through the fog. But in this room, time remained suspended, tethered to the figure who floated with his hand, still clutching a pencil. Maigret knew the case would not yield quickly. It had already claimed its atmosphere, and atmosphere was a thing more stubborn than fact. He exhaled a long plume of smoke and murmured, as if to the drowned man himself, "We'll see." By midday the fog had thinned, though the air retained that peculiar dampness that seemed to cling to coats and settle into the very bones of the city. Maigret had returned briefly to Quai des Orfèvres, where the river slid sluggishly beneath the windows, its surface dull as pewter. Reports had begun to arrive in fragments, the sergeant's notes, the first hurried impressions of Lucas, and a telegram confirming that the hotel truly had been closed, its owners absent for nearly a year. Yet all the paperwork and half-legible notes did not fill the silence that still echoed in the inspector's mind. He carried the drowned poet with him like an unfinished phrase. He left the office without fanfare, walking at his unhurried pace toward the Quartier Latin. Here the streets bore the unmistakable rhythm of youth and weariness mingled together, students with dishevelled hair carrying stacks of books under their arms, professors moving more stiffly, their spectacles misted, their coats buttoned to the neck. Cafes lined the boulevards, their windows glowing with yellow kerosene lamps, even in the pale daylight, smoke curling above tables where men lingered too long over black coffee. The quarter smelled of stale tobacco and ink, of cheap wine, of damp wool coats steaming near stoves. It was here, in this neighbourhood of perpetual chatter and shifting faces, that the poet had supposedly moved among others of his kind. The drowned man's name, barely whispered yet, already colouring the air with rumour, was Vautier. Some recalled him reciting verses at tables cluttered with glasses, voice hoarse but intent, as though each word carried the weight of survival. Others remembered him as a nuisance, borrowing francs he never returned, vanishing for weeks at a time, then reappearing in rags. Maigret listened to all of it with his habitual patience, neither accepting nor dismissing, allowing the stories to wash over him like the smoke that hung in the room. At one café on Rue Saint-Jacques, a waiter recognized the description. A thin man with a dark apron, his hands perpetually damp from wiping glasses, he leaned against the counter, eyes flicking nervously toward the inspector's broad silhouette. "Yes, monsieur." He came often, sat near the stove, always scribbling. Paid when he could, which was seldom. Once, a fight broke out. He shouted at another man, another writer maybe, or a student. Something about stealing his words. He left before the gendarmes arrived. Maigret let him speak without interruption, puffing slowly on his pipe. He knew better than to press too hard at first. People often revealed more in the spaces between their words. The waiter shrugged, lowering his voice. There were women too, not many, one in particular. She had dark hair, always a scarf at her throat. She brought him bread sometimes or wine. He called her his muse, but others laughed. She hasn't been here for weeks. A detail, faint, but not to be discarded. Maigret's mind fixed on the image of a woman bringing bread and wine to a man who drowned alone in a shuttered hotel. He jotted the note quietly, his thick fingers clumsy with the pencil, yet precise enough to record what mattered. Later, at a second cafe, a man in a frayed jacket leaned across the table, eager to be heard. His breath smelled of sour wine, but his eyes shone with the satisfaction of memory. Vautier? Yes, I knew him. Always speaking of destiny, of the injustice of publishers, of the blindness of critics, he had a temper. Once he tore up his own pages before our eyes, shouting that Paris would regret ignoring him. Then he gathered the scraps again, smoothed them with trembling hands, and left in silence. We didn't see him for a month after that. These recollections accumulated like pebbles in Maigret's pocket, small, heavy, yet of uncertain value until weighed together. He saw before him the outline of a man caught between pride and desperation, straining against indifference, drowning perhaps long before he entered the tub of stagnant water. Yet such portraits, however vivid, did not explain the locked hotel, the extinguished life. He drifted further into the quarter, pausing at bookstalls where vendors shrugged at the name Vautier. One, a stout man with a greasy cap, admitted he had once taken a few handwritten sheets on consignment, poems inked in an uneven hand. None had sold. After weeks he had used the paper to wrap old books. He spoke without malice, only the weary pragmatism of a man who had seen too many dreamers starve at his stall. As dusk neared, Maigret found himself at a small bistro, narrow and dim, where the smell of boiled beef clung to the walls. He sat alone at a corner table, ordering a glass of white wine, his hat placed on the bench beside him. He did not summon witnesses here. Instead, he let the quarter itself speak, its voices drifting around him. Students argued over politics, lovers whispered, an accordion played faintly from somewhere beyond. Each sound seemed to carry echoes of the drowned poet, as if the man's shadow lingered over the quartier, etched into the very timbre of its evenings. He thought not for the first time of how fragile reputations were in Paris. A man might shout his verses to a smoky room, convince himself of genius, quarrel with his peers, and within days of his disappearance he would be reduced to scraps of memory, vague gossip, distorted impressions. Now Vautier was not a man, but a shadow, flickering in recollections, a figure more rumour than flesh. Maigret felt a heaviness, not only for the death itself, but for the way a life could sink so quickly beneath the surface of collective memory. The inspector sipped his wine, eyes half closed. He pictured again the notebook with its blurred lines, the stubborn pencil in the dead man's grip. Was it desperation to be heard, or a final gesture of defiance? He did not yet know. But he sensed that the Quartier Latin, with all its chatter, offered more questions than answers. When he finally rose, the street lamps had been lit, their yellow glow pushing back the shadows only by inches. He walked slowly, hat pulled low, pipe glowing faintly. The quarter was alive with laughter and quarrels, but to him it seemed muffled, distant, as though Paris itself were listening for the next word in a half-finished verse. Behind him the cafes carried on, tables filled, glasses clinking, smoke rising. Yet the shadow of Vautier lingered in every corner, a reminder that even among crowds one could drown unseen. Maigret turned toward the Seine, its surface black now under the night sky, and paused at the bridge. The water flowed sluggishly, carrying reflections of lanterns. He leaned on the stone parapet, pipe smoke mingling with the mist. Somewhere, A tugboat horn echoed again, low and mournful. He felt the case pressing inward, not yet with the clarity of facts, but with the insistent weight of atmosphere. It was not enough to trace Vautier's shadow through cafes and gossip. He would need to pierce the silence of the provinces, where telegrams arrived crumpled and delayed, where lives were not forgotten so quickly. But for now, in this quarter where voices rose and fell, he carried with him only fragments. The memory of quarrels, a woman with dark hair, unpaid debts, and a shadow that stretched longer than the man himself. He exhaled, straightened his coat, and began the slow walk back to Quai des Orfèvres, his heavy steps echoing faintly against the cobblestones, as if already searching for the next clue hidden in the silence of night. The telegram arrived the following morning, its envelope smudged, the paper creased, as though it had travelled not merely across miles, but through the indifference of clerks and the dampness of rural post offices. Maigret received it at Quai des Orfèvres, where the lamps still burned pale against the grey of early day, and the smell of strong coffee lingered from the clerk's desk. He slit the envelope with a thick finger, unfolded the flimsy sheet, and read the few words written in stiff capitals. Vautier, known in Moulins. Please advise. Station master. Moulins. A town not large, not small, set in the quiet heart of the provinces, where the rhythm of life slowed beneath the weight of tradition and familiarity. To Parisians it was a place passed by on the way to somewhere else. Yet it was here. The telegram suggested that the drowned poet had once been known. The letter carried no explanation, only that faint tremor of provincial curiosity, as if the name had stirred memories best left untouched. Maigret stood for a moment, the paper crackling between his fingers, pipe smoke curling upward from the ashtray. He imagined the station master at his wooden counter, cap tilted, pen scratching, perhaps uncertain whether to involve himself, yet compelled by the intrusion of Parisian tragedy into provincial calm. That in itself meant something. By afternoon, Maigret was seated in a compartment of the train, its leather worn smooth, the air filled with the mingled odours of coal smoke, damp wool, and stale sandwiches. Outside, the suburbs slipped away, rows of grey houses dissolving into fields glazed with mist. He travelled alone, as he often preferred, leaning back heavily, his hat tilted forward, pipe extinguished for lack of draught. The rhythmic sway of the carriage lulled him into a state between waking and reflection, where the poet Vautier seemed to sit across from him, shadowy, silent, his hollow cheeks accentuated by the dim light. The inspector considered what he knew, fragments of verse, quarrels in cafes, a woman with dark hair, debts unpaid, a notebook blurred by water, and now, Moulins. Why there? Was it birthplace, refuge, or exile? The poet's shadow stretched further than the Quartier Latin, threading itself into provincial soil. Maigret felt the faint excitement that always accompanied such a shift, not the thrill of adventure, but the gravity of following a life backward into its forgotten rooms. The train slowed into the station at dusk, the platform bathed in a yellow gloom from weak electric bulbs. Figures moved with deliberate slowness, women in shawls, men in caps, children clutching their mothers' skirts. Coal smoke hung low, and the hiss of steam from the engine mingled with the faint scent of wet wood. Maigret stepped heavily onto the platform, overcoat collar turned up against the chill, eyes scanning the faces with their subtle flickers of recognition or curiosity. He was a stranger here, yet not entirely. The uniform hat, the broad build, the deliberate pace announced his profession before he spoke a word. The station master awaited him at the office, a thin man with spectacles and a carefully trimmed moustache, hands folded on the counter as though to steady himself. He produced a ledger, tapping its worn cover with a bony finger. Yes, monsieur, I remember him. Years ago now, Vautier. A name not often spoken here, but one that leaves traces. He arrived often on the evening train from Paris, restless, eyes darting, always with a satchel of papers. Stayed in a boarding house near the river, though never for long. He left debts, I believe, and more than one quarrel. The innkeeper complained he kept odd hours, scribbling through the night, muttering verses. Some here thought him touched in the head. The station-master spoke without judgment, only the dry tone of a man accustomed to observing travellers pass through, leaving impressions like footprints in mud. He turned the ledger so Maigret could see, neat entries of arrivals and departures, the name Vautier written 3 times in faded ink. Dates stretching back several years. A man neither resident nor stranger, suspended between Paris and the provinces, never belonging wholly to either. Maigret pocketed the information, thanked the station-master with a nod, and stepped into the town. Dusk had thickened, lamps flickered along narrow streets paved with cobblestones, still wet from afternoon rain. The air smelled of coal fires and damp earth. He found the boarding house with little difficulty, a squat building with peeling shutters, its door half ajar. The landlady, stout and sharp-eyed, admitted him after one glance at his card. Vautier? Yes, I remember, a poor tenant, always late with rent, yet polite enough when sober. He spoke of poetry, of fame awaiting him in Paris. Some nights he returned drunk, shouting that the world would regret its blindness. Then he would fall silent for days, staring at papers he never showed. Once he left suddenly, leaving nothing behind but a broken pen and unpaid bills. Her voice carried both irritation and faint pity, as though she had grown accustomed to such figures passing briefly through her house, burning with feverish dreams, extinguishing themselves quietly. "Did he have visitors?" Maigret asked. "Rarely. A woman once or twice, dark hair, always a scarf about her throat." She looked at him as though he were something fragile, though I never saw her smile. They argued, softly but bitterly behind closed doors. Again the image of the woman, the same figure glimpsed in the Quartier Latin, now here, in the provinces. The inspector felt her presence sharpening, not yet a suspect, not yet a witness, but a thread woven tightly into the drowned poet's shadow. That night, Maigret sat in the small inn by the station, its dining room quiet, save for the clink of cutlery. He ate simply, stew with potatoes, and sipped red wine from a chipped glass. Around him, townsfolk spoke in hushed tones, their glances sliding toward him before darting away. They knew why he was here. In such towns, nothing remained secret. Rumour moved quicker than trains. The name Vautier was already stirring again, pulled from the dust of memory by the news of his death in Paris. The inspector felt the weight of those unspoken conversations. He did not need to hear the words to sense their shape. Tales of the eccentric poet, debts unpaid, quarrels, whispers of madness. Yet beneath gossip lay the stubborn fact of a man who had once lived here, pacing these very streets, clutching his satchel of papers. He had fled to Paris, only to return here in memory, summoned by a telegram written in stiff capitals. Maigret finished his wine, pipe glowing faintly as he leaned back. He thought of the poet's journey, the restless shuttling between Paris and Moulins, between anonymity and brief recognition, between hope and despair. A man who belonged nowhere, finally drowned in silence. Yet something in that restlessness suggested more than despair, perhaps pursuit, perhaps escape. The inspector felt the question settle in his mind like a stone in a riverbed. What had driven Vautier back and forth across these tracks between the fog of the Seine and the stillness of the provinces? Outside, the town lay hushed beneath the night. The station lamps glowed faintly, their reflections trembling in puddles. Somewhere a dog barked once, then silence resumed. Maigret drew on his pipe, exhaling smoke that mingled with the lamplight, his gaze steady, his thoughts patient. He knew he would leave Moulin with more questions than answers, yet with each step the shadow of Vautier grew clearer. The poet's past was not a void, but a tangle of debts, quarrels, and quiet despair, and within that tangle lay the key to the Shuttered hotel in Paris. For now Maigret let the silence of the provinces speak, aware that beneath its calm surface lay the faint ripples of a man who had drowned long before water touched his lips. He returned to Paris in the kind of dusk that pressed low over the river, turning the Seine into a long strip of tarnished metal. Quai des Orfèvres stood, as it always did, solid, faintly austere, its windows holding small rectangles of yellow light. And Maigret felt, as he stepped through the door, the familiar change in weight that came with crossing its threshold. The corridors smelled of damp wool and tobacco, and somewhere a clerk coughed behind a door. On his desk lay the necessary nuisances of a case beginning to breathe, a typed memorandum that said nothing new, with great seriousness, a note from Lucas, spare and clean, reporting that no neighbours had seen anyone enter the Shuttered hotel for days, and a short message from Janvier promising a circuit of the cafés near Saint-Michel before nightfall. He stood over these papers without reading them twice. The facts were too few to justify their stiffness. What he carried back from Moulin had more substance and no ink. 3 old dates in a station ledger, a landlady's tired memory, a woman with a scarf at her throat who belonged both to Paris and the provinces. He let himself into his own flat with the relief of a man setting down a heavy coat after a long rain. The corridors smelled of polish and onions. Madame Maigret was at the stove. She called without turning, simply a mellow "You're back," and he answered, as he always did, a low "yes," more a sound than a word, entirely sufficient between them. The table was already laid, the white cloth a little stiff with starch, knives reflecting the lamp's mild glow. He hung his overcoat carefully, set his hat on the rack, and washed his hands in the small basin near the scullery, watching the grey water, cloud, as if some residue of the roads he had walked refused to leave his skin. When he came into the kitchen, she handed him a bowl. The steam rose with the smell of leeks and potatoes, and he breathed it the way an exhausted swimmer takes air after a long stroke under water. They ate with that quiet that was not silence between them, the steady business of soup, bread torn without fuss, a carafe of modest wine that made a soft, hollow sound each time he refilled his glass. He had learned long ago that his work did not need to be recited for her to understand its weight. She could see it in the manner he held his pipe, or in the way his eyes drifted to the window and remained there, not looking, but measuring the darkness. Still there were evenings when a case, to find its shape, needed the room it found only here, among the plain plates and the breathing of the stew-pot. "A poet," he said at last, half smiling at the word, as it left his mouth as though it were a small object he was turning over with 2 fingers. Or a man who called himself one, Vautier. She glanced up, then lowered her eyes again to her plate. "Poor?" she asked, with no curiosity beyond the fact. "Yes." He broke another piece of bread. "Poor, proud, lived between places. Moulins knows him, and the Quartier Latin pretends to. He drowned in a tub in a hotel no one should have been able to enter, and yet someone did." She nodded, not as a wife indulging a story, but as a listener accepting the first movement of a melody she already recognized. "Was he alone?" she said. Maigret tilted his head. "There was a woman once, dark hair, a scarf. She brought him bread and wine. She argued with him in a boarding house by the river at Moulins, and then she argued with him again, perhaps in a café near Saint-Michel, No one remembers her name, of course. They remember only the scarf. Madame Maigret set down her fork, wiped her fingers with a corner of the cloth, and rose to fetch the pot. When she returned, she poured a little more stew into his bowl, the potatoes settling with a soft thud. If she brought bread, she said almost to herself, she must have known his hunger, and if she argued softly, she must have loved him a little. Then she looked at him, not sentimentally but with the practical tenderness that was her way. "You'll find her," she added, not as a prediction, but as if remarking that the weather would turn, as weather always does. He did not answer. Instead, he reached for his pipe, tamped tobacco with a thumb as broad and sure as a mason's, and waited to light it until she had opened the small window above the sink. The night air slid in, smelling of damp stone and the river. He drew the first careful puffs and felt the day settle into its rightful distances. The kitchen clock chipped away at the hour with the confidence of a thing that has never been wrong because it has never tried to be right to the minute. "You remember," she said, resuming her seat, "that case with the watchmaker in Saint-Amand? He also had a woman who came and left with bread and wine. The end was not the bread and not the wine. The end," he repeated softly, "is rarely what it pretends to be." He lifted his glass, drank, and set it down with a small sound that might have been agreement. They spoke of other things for a while. The butcher, who had sent a better cut than usual without charging, a neighbour's child with a cough, a cousin's postcard from Nantes. And the case slid to the side, as if it too were a guest at table who had withdrawn a respectful distance for the moment. But when the dishes were washed and stacked, and the lamp turned low, Maigret remained seated, the pipe cooling in his hand, and the drowned poet returned without ceremony, as sure of his place in the room as any old acquaintance. "There was a notebook," he said. "The words ran, but one line may remain, beyond the river fog. It could be anything. It could be a poet's posing. Still, men do not drown for a line unless it is attached to something heavier." "You think it was not despair?" Madame Maigret asked. "I think despair is a patient animal," he said. "It gnaws, but it does not always know how to lock a door from the outside and leave no trace." She accepted the remark with a slight inclination of the head that meant, this, then, is where the weight lies. He felt, as he often did, that the rooms of his mind aligned a little better under her gaze, the useless corridors closing off, the plain passage straightening. When she went to the bedroom to set out fresh linen, he stayed at the table and emptied his pockets methodically, not out of pedantry, but to let happen what sometimes happens when objects breathe the same air and decide to speak to one another. From his wallet he took the telegram, crumpled twice, Vautier. "Known in Moulins, please advise." From the inner pocket, a creased calling card the station master had pressed on him, his name written with the precise, old-fashioned loops of a schoolmaster. From his coat, a café receipt he had kept for no reason at all. Yesterday's date, 2 coffees and a glass of white, paid by a neighbour at a table near the window. The waiter's cramped initials in the corner like a secret signature. He placed these in a row and looked at them as if they were men in a line-up refusing to meet his eye. The café receipt meant nothing. And yet he remembered, with that small inward start he trusted more than most testimonies, that the waiter on Rue Saint-Jacques, the one vigilant as a cat, had spoken of a fight about stolen words, and that the same man had described almost carelessly a matchbox the poet always turned in his fingers while thinking. Not a nervous habit, more a ritual, as though the smoothness of the cardboard steadied the lines in his head. A matchbox bears a name, an address. He had seen none in the shuttered room. Had the poet set it down elsewhere? The talisman forgotten at the end? Or had someone pocketed it, a tiny thing easily overlooked, a thing that might have linked the drowned man's hands to a very specific counter, a particular bistro? Madame Maigret returned, wiped her hands and lowered herself into the chair again with the small sigh that proclaimed nothing more dramatic than contented tiredness. "You look at those papers," she said, amused, "as if they will confess among themselves." "Sometimes they do." He folded the café chit once, twice, the paper becoming soft at the edges. A waiter's hand leaves traces. Words about stolen words also leave traces. She glanced toward the window. The city had gone quieter. Even the river sounded as if it was sleeping with one ear open. "Will you go out again?" she asked. He considered. The urge to walk, to let the streets talk, had come upon him as it often did after these suppers, when the case had been allowed to acquire the shape of a human thing and not merely an event. "Not tonight," he said finally, and it was both promise and self-discipline. "Janvier is in the quarter. He will bring back something, perhaps nothing, which is also something." They sat there a while longer, a domestic truce between fatigue and duty. When at last he rose, he did so with that deliberate gathering of himself that suggested neither reluctance nor haste. He wiped the table with the flat of his palm, a habit with no purpose beyond the satisfaction of leaving wood bare and clean. He kissed her cheek as he passed, and she rested her hand for a second on his sleeve, a touch that said what words would have made too heavy. Be careful, and be gentle with the dead. In the bedroom he undressed slowly, folding his trousers over the chair, placing his watch on the nightstand so that its faint ticking could keep company with the darker clock in the kitchen. Sleep came quickly, as it does to men who have learned not to pursue it, but it came threaded with images that did not press hard enough to be called dreams. A scarf the colour of wine, a tub that held a face that did not accuse, a ledger with 3 dates under a name written too carefully, as if the hand that wrote it were already apologizing. He woke once, near 3, and lay listening. Somewhere a carriage rolled, somewhere a door closed with the ineffable softness of the very late hour. He thought of the woman again, because the night belongs to women in cases. Their footsteps, their keys, their choices between pity and weariness. He turned his face into the cool side of the pillow and let her recede to where she was not yet nameable. In the morning, he was back at Quai des Orfèvres before the second pot of coffee had finished boiling. Janvier had left a note on his desk that smelled faintly of tobacco and damp wool, as if the man had written it with his coat still on. The waiter near Saint-Michel remembered something more, it seemed. A name. That could be a name or a nickname. The suggestion of a café not on Rue Saint-Jacques, but just off the Place Saint-Michel, where the accordion played too late, and a small man with a red earlobe listened to all quarrels as if they were music. And there was talk of a matchbox, finely printed, with a little lighthouse on it, and the words "Au phare" below, handed out only to regulars. He read it once, lit his pipe, and read it again. Outside, the fog had lifted a little, revealing the river in its ordinary brown. He stood, settled his hat on his head, and felt the day align around a very simple intention. Bread, wine, a scarf, a matchbox with a lighthouse, a poet who drowned in a tub in a room that pretended to be forgotten. If the waiter's ear had not lied, then the next door to open would be one that smelled of coffee and old wood, and late hours, with a lighthouse printed on cardboard slips, no longer than a man's thumb. He took his coat from the peg and gave his secretary the minimal information that keeps an office from imagining catastrophes. As he stepped into the corridor, he felt the case move forward not with a leap, but with the slow, good traction of a boot on wet stone. He thought of Madame Maigret's remark, that bread and soft arguments meant a little love, and of his own, that despair does not carry keys. Somewhere in the quarter, a waiter would polish a glass and try to remember whether the dark-haired woman smoked, and if she did, whether she asked for a light, or always had her own matches. He closed the door behind him. The corridor absorbed the sound with its usual discretion. The river waited, the bridges waited, the cafes were already awake. And there, among them, the waiter's testimony would be ready to say either too much or almost nothing, which in certain cases amounts to the same thing until it is weighed in the right pair of hands. The café on the corner of Rue Saint-André-des-Arts stood with its windows clouded by smoke, the glass smudged by countless hands pressing in from the street. Inside, the air was a thick blend of black coffee, damp coats, and the sour tang of red wine. Lamps hung low, their yellow halos catching in the haze, making the room feel more subterranean than open to the Paris evening. This was where Janvier had told him to come, where a waiter remembered the drowned poet not as an abstraction, but as a daily presence, a man who had occupied a chair, ordered drinks, left impressions. Maigret pushed open the door and entered without hurry. Conversations dipped, just a fraction, at the sight of his broad frame, the pipe in his hand, the coat heavy on his shoulders. He gave the room no sign of acknowledgment, moving instead toward the counter, where the waiter polished a glass with distracted persistence. The man was thin, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair slicked flat with a perfunctory care that did not extend to his eyes, which darted like quicksilver. "Evening," Maigret said. It was less greeting than permission for the man to begin. "Yes, monsieur. You're here about Vautier." The words tumbled quickly, as if speaking them sooner would lighten their weight. He was here, often, sat there. He gestured with the damp rag to a table near the wall, half in shadow, where a lamp with a crooked shade flickered as if reluctant to burn steady. Maigret turned his head slightly, noting the spot, then looked back at the waiter. He did not press, only waited, pipe stem resting loosely between his teeth. The man cleared his throat. He drank wine mostly when he had money, coffee when he didn't. Scribbled in that notebook of his, the one you must have found. Sometimes he read lines aloud, to no one in particular, as though the room owed him an audience. Some laughed, some ignored him, a few listened. He would grow angry quickly, especially if someone mocked. He had pride, yes, pride sharper than his hunger. The inspector nodded, watching the words settle. The waiter shifted, lowering his voice. There were quarrels. Once with another writer, a big fellow, beard like a broom. They shouted about stolen words. Vautier accused him of taking a verse, a line, something about fog and rivers. It seemed madness, yet Vautier shook with fury. They almost came to blows, but the bearded one laughed and left. Vautier stayed, trembling, scribbling harder than ever. Stolen words. Maigret felt a faint stir, like a current beneath calm water. He let the silence stretch until the waiter filled it again. There was a woman too, dark hair, always the scarf. She would sit across from him, calm, watching him like one might watch a child. She paid for his drinks when he could not. They argued, but softly, voices low. Once she left in tears. He followed but returned alone an hour later, eyes red, no words left in him. The scarf again. The woman who threaded through both Paris and Moulins, who carried bread and wine, who argued gently, but walked away with tears. Maigret's gaze lingered on the lamp above the counter, its glass dim with smoke. He asked, "Do you know her name?" The waiter hesitated, then shook his head. No, she wasn't one of the regulars. She came from elsewhere, perhaps the provinces. She spoke with a softness not common here. He called her Claire once, but I don't know if it was her name or merely a word he gave her. Claire. A name or an illusion? He jotted it carefully in his notebook, the pencil heavy in his hand. "And the matchbox?" Maigret asked suddenly, turning his eyes directly on the man. The waiter flinched, caught off guard. "The one with the lighthouse." The rag froze in the man's grip. For a second, his eyes darted left and right, as though considering denial, but he saw the inspector's gaze and surrendered. "Yes, monsieur, he carried one. From here. We give them to regulars, au phare, you see." He liked to turn it in his fingers. Said it steadied his thoughts. "He left it once, and I kept it behind the counter. But when he came the next evening, it was gone. I thought perhaps he had taken it back." Maigret's jaw tightened around the stem of his pipe. "It was not in his room." The waiter swallowed. "Then someone else has it." The inspector let the words hang, their implication sharper than any admission. A matchbox, a lighthouse, a scrap of cardboard that bound the drowned poet to this café, to this very counter. If it had vanished, it meant hands other than Vautier's had closed around it. Hands that had entered the Shuttered hotel, that had perhaps struck the balance between despair and murder. Maigret exhaled, slow and steady, pipe smoke drifting upward. He looked once more at the table where Vautier had sat, notebook open, wine glass empty, eyes burning with a fire that others mistook for madness. The shadow of the drowned poet still clung to the room, faint but undeniable. He thanked the waiter with a curt nod and stepped outside. The night was raw, the Seine exhaling mist that blurred the street lamps into trembling halos. Behind him the café continued as before, glasses clinking, voices rising and falling. Yet for Maigret the atmosphere had shifted. The testimony had given Vautier shape, not as a forgotten shadow, but as a man burning, quarrelling, clinging to words as though they alone could save him. The inspector stood in the street, collar turned against the damp, and thought of Claire, if that was her name, of the scarf, the bread, the tears. He thought of stolen words, of pride that bordered on madness, of a matchbox with a lighthouse that had vanished from a counter. The pieces did not yet fit, but he felt their weight pressing against one another, as though waiting for the hand that would align them. He lit his pipe again, drew the smoke deep, and walked slowly toward the river. The fog was rising, heavier now, wrapping the city in silence. Each step echoed faintly on the wet stones. He did not hurry. Cases like this were not solved by speed, but by listening. To the city, to the gossip of waiters, to the quiet between a husband and wife, to the silences left behind in shuttered hotels. The drowned poet was no longer only a body in a tub. He was a presence, a shadow in cafes, a quarrel shouted and then forgotten, a woman's scarf trailing behind her as she vanished into the night. And Maigret, pipe glowing in the fog, felt the case drawing him deeper into its current, like the river itself, pulling at the stones of its bed. The next morning, Paris wore its usual mask, grey skies, streets glossed with last night's drizzle, market carts rattling over cobblestones, while vendors shouted in voices already hoarse with routine. At Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret leaned over his desk, the smoke from his pipe curling in lazy spirals, and listened as Lucas and Janvier reported in turn. They had been out all night, following threads so thin they might have been mistaken for fog itself. Yet each had returned with fragments that, placed side by side, seemed to breathe faintly like a hidden fire. Lucas spoke first, his tone clipped, efficient, the voice of a man who measured distance in footsteps and facts. Around Saint-Michel, several know him by sight. They say he wandered late, sat near the river steps. A bookseller on Rue de la Huchette recalls him staring for hours at titles he never bought. Once he traded a verse, just a few lines, for an old pamphlet. The bookseller laughed at him, but he took the pamphlet anyway. Janvier, younger and less guarded, added colour. In the cafes they called him the Phantom. Came and went, left no tips, argued about poetry with students who didn't remember his name the next morning. But there is something else, Chief. A man at a wine shop swears he saw Vautier 3 nights ago, alive, buying a bottle. He wasn't alone. The woman was with him, dark hair, scarf at her throat. They left together, heading toward Rue des Écoles. Maigret shifted slightly in his chair, heavy shoulders leaning forward. The room grew denser with silence, broken only by the hiss of coal in the stove. 3 nights ago, that meant Vautier had not drowned in despair days earlier, alone and forgotten. He had walked the streets with her, bottle in hand, heading toward the Shuttered hotel, where death would finally claim him. Lucas produced a folded paper. We traced the matchboxes. Only 2 cafes in the quarter give them out with that lighthouse emblem. One is Au Phare, where you went. The other, a smaller place near Odéon. I went there. They know Vautier. They say he came sometimes when he quarrelled with the waiter at the other, always with scraps of verse in his pockets. Once he pawned his coat to pay for drinks. Did he mention her? Maigret asked. Lucas shook his head. No one there saw her. Only in Au Phare, but they say he was desperate, more than usual, spoke of leaving Paris, of going back south. No details, just the kind of talk a man makes when he has nowhere left to turn. Janvier leaned forward, eager. Chief, there's more. At the hotel, the Shuttered one, neighbours whisper they saw a figure slip inside last week. A shadow, nothing clear. A man, maybe, or the woman. The concierge across the street swears she heard laughter one night. Not much, only a burst. She thought it was students. But perhaps not. Maigret let the words settle, pipe resting cold in his mouth. He tapped the bowl against the edge of the ashtray and refilled it with his careful, deliberate gestures as though each grain of tobacco held the measure of time itself. He struck a match, cupped it against the draught, and drew until the flame caught. Only then did he speak. Good, he said simply. Now we walk. They left Quai des Orfèvres together, 3 figures heavy with coats, stepping into the morning drizzle. Paris spread before them like a map that only they could read. Narrow alleys where shutters closed too quickly, cafes where smoke curled above conspiracies, the damp air carrying whispers of the drowned poet's last days. Lucas peeled off toward the quay, his stride purposeful. He would question bargemen, porters, the men who carried crates at dawn and saw more than they admitted. Janvier, lighter on his feet, headed toward the cafes near the university, where gossip rolled quicker than coins across counters. Maigret took his own route, the slow one, pacing the cobbled streets near Rue des Écoles, pipe clenched, eyes half-lidded, as though he were merely a man strolling with no urgency. But every step, every glance, pulled the case tighter around him. At a tobacconist's he paused, ordering matches he did not need, and asked casually whether anyone remembered Vautier. The shopkeeper shrugged. Too many ragged men passed through. But a boy delivering papers piped up. Yes, monsieur, I saw him. He used to write under the street lamp there on the corner. He said the light was pure. I thought he was mad, but he gave me a coin once for keeping quiet when the constable asked. At a bakery, Maigret lingered by the window. The baker's wife leaned forward, her hands white with flour. The woman came here, she whispered. She bought bread at odd hours, always a half loaf, never more. I saw her with him once. He looked ill. She pressed the bread into his hands like a mother. But her eyes were frightened. He nodded, thanked her, left. The drizzle thickened into a fine mist, coating his hat brim with beads that gleamed briefly before sliding down. He turned into a side street where the shutters hung crooked and the smell of damp stone clung. Here, silence seemed thicker, as though the walls themselves withheld what they had seen. By evening, they reconvened at Quai des Orfèvres. Lucas arrived first, coat wet, notebook smudged. Nothing from the bargeman, but a rag-picker near Pont-Neuf recalls a man throwing papers into the river. Last week, before dawn, could have been Vautier or someone else. The rag-picker only remembered the scraps floating, ink dissolving. Janvier followed, more animated. "Chief, I found a student who swears he heard Vautier recite a new poem 2 nights before his death, a fragment about drowning. The boy thought it was metaphor. He laughed. But Vautier's eyes, he said, were serious, almost prophetic." Maigret listened, heavy hands folded, pipe smoke wreathing his head. He thought of the scraps of verse, the bread, the scarf, the bottle of wine, the missing matchbox. He thought of a man who had quarrelled over stolen words, who had written about fog and rivers, who had perhaps known too clearly how his story would end. "Tomorrow," Maigret said at last, "we return to the hotel, not to the body, to the silence." The 2 inspectors exchanged glances but asked nothing. They knew that tone, the weight of patience. Sometimes it was not in new testimony that truth revealed itself, but in the way a shutter creaked, in the smell that lingered where it should not, in the dust that lay too thinly on a chair. Outside, night had drawn its curtain across Paris. The Seine moved darkly, carrying the reflections of lamps in trembling shards. Somewhere, an accordion played, its notes rising and falling like the breath of the city itself. Maigret stood at the window, gazing out, and felt the presence of the drowned poet more strongly than ever. Vautier was no longer only a man in a tub or a quarrelsome ghost of cafes. He was a trail of bread crusts, of words half-remembered, of debts unpaid, of a woman's scarf trailing into shadow. And Maigret, pipe glowing in the darkness, knew the case was no longer a question of how, but of why, and why always weighed heavier than how. The city outside seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for him to step once more into its streets, to draw closer to the truth that floated just beneath the surface of its fog. The story broke in the papers before Maigret had time to silence it. It was inevitable. The discovery of a body in a shuttered hotel in the heart of Paris, a poet clutching a pencil like a relic, could not remain confined to police reports and whispered testimonies. By dawn, the kiosks on the boulevards displayed headlines that bled through the fog like neon. Poet found dead in abandoned hotel. Drowning or murder. The tragic end of a forgotten genius. Each paper sang its own refrain, and the city, hungry for scandal, dressed in melancholy, listened with avid ears. Maigret bought the morning editions one by one, his heavy fingers smudging the cheap ink, and carried them to his office at Quai des Orfèvres. He read them slowly, pipe smoke curling around him, his face impassive. Yet, as each column unfolded, he felt that old blend of irritation and resignation. The press invented truths faster than he could untangle lies. Here, Vautier was a genius, misunderstood and betrayed. There, he was a madman, half vagabond, half prophet, who had chosen death as his final verse. Another painted him as the victim of jealous rivals, hinting darkly at conspiracies in the Quartier Latin. Names appeared in print, critics who had never published a line about him while he lived, women who claimed to have inspired his verses, Publishers who denied turning him away but whose ledgers told otherwise. Some insisted the police had evidence of foul play. Others declared it a simple suicide, a man too frail for the indifference of the world. The truth lay buried beneath exaggeration, like a stone sinking in the Seine. Janvier entered with his usual nervous energy, tossing his hat on the rack. "Chief, everyone's talking. At the cafes, in the markets. They all have a version. Some swear he was killed for his words. Others that he was part of some secret society of poets who drink and die together. One woman said she saw him walking by the river after he was supposed to be dead." Lucas followed more quietly, carrying the weight of streets in his damp coat. "The press is muddying the waters. People are less willing to speak. They don't want to contradict what they've read, or they prefer the drama of it." Maigret nodded without lifting his eyes from the paper in his hand. He had seen it before, the moment when rumour and print fused into a fog thicker than the Seine's own, obscuring fact, turning witnesses into actors who rehearsed lines they had read that morning. He laid the newspapers in a row on his desk. "Listen," he said, his voice steady, almost tired. "In one he is a martyr, in another a lunatic, in another still a genius neglected by fools, but in none of them is he simply a man who lived, ate bread, quarrelled, wrote badly or well, loved perhaps, and then died. They will paint him larger than life because that is how they sell. But somewhere in these exaggerations is a fragment, a shadow of truth." He tapped a headline with his broad finger. "The Poet's Mysterious Companion." The article spoke of a woman glimpsed in cafes, described vaguely, with flourishes, hair black as ink, eyes burning with devotion. One gossip column even gave her a name, though Maigret doubted it. Claire de Montfort, supposedly the daughter of a provincial family, fallen into disgrace for following an artist. The inspector read the lines with the same patience he gave to a suspect who lied with every breath. Claire, perhaps. Montfort, unlikely. Yet the scarf, the bread, the quiet arguments, those details repeated by waiters and landladies, rang truer than any invention of a journalist. By afternoon, the case had become a spectacle. Outside Quai des Orfèvres, a small crowd lingered, eager for any glimpse of the inspector. Reporters pressed close, their notebooks raised like weapons, their questions clattering over one another. "Is it murder, Inspector? Was the poet part of a clandestine circle? What of the mysterious woman? Is she in custody?" Maigret pushed through them silently, pipe clamped between his teeth, his hat brim low. He answered nothing. The more he ignored them, the louder they grew, until their words became meaningless noise. He found relief only once he had turned into a narrow alley and left their chorus behind. That evening, Paris itself seemed to hum with the story. At the Brasserie Dauphine, men in bowler hats discussed it as though they had known Vautier personally. At the markets, fishwives repeated what they had read in the Matin with embellishments of their own. The poet who had drowned became a mirror for everyone's fantasy. A genius persecuted, a madman consumed, a lover betrayed, a prophet silenced. The city fed on him, even in death. Maigret sat at a table near the window, pipe smoke curling in front of him, and listened. He knew that rumour, though poisonous, often revealed more than silence. People repeated what they wanted to believe, and within that choice lay the shadow of truth. Lucas arrived later with a new piece of gossip. A journalist claims Vautier had enemies in Moulins. Says he fled after a scandal, something to do with a married woman. No details, only hints. It may be nothing, but it spreads. Maigret puffed thoughtfully. It may be more than nothing. A scandal leaves marks, even if time tries to erase them. Tomorrow we write to the commissaire in Moulins. Quietly. We need facts, not rumor." He returned home late, his overcoat heavy with the damp of evening. Madame Maigret met him with the calm that steadied him more than any silence. She had already read the papers. He could tell by the way she folded them with neat precision, as though putting the noise back in its box. "They say he was a great man," she murmured, setting his supper before him. "They say many things," he replied. "Too many. If he had been great, Paris would not have forgotten him until now." "And yet," she said gently, "they write as if they remember him well." He nodded, eating slowly, the weight of her remark settling deeper than the meal. Perhaps greatness, in Paris, was nothing more than the ability to leave behind a rumor worth printing. That night, long after she had gone to bed, Maigret sat by the window, pipe embers glowing faintly. The river moved in silence below, carrying reflections of lamps that quivered like fragile truths. He thought of Vautier, no longer merely a drowned body, but a figure draped in the city's gossip, clothed in the false grandeur of print. To find the man beneath, Maigret knew, he would need to strip away each layer of invention until only the simple, unadorned facts remained. A woman with dark hair, a scarf, a bottle of wine, a tub of water in a forgotten hotel. Yet even he felt the pressing inward, its words shaping his own thoughts, its rumors blurring the outlines. He tamped his pipe with deliberate care, resisting the current, and whispered into the darkness, "You were a man before you were a story." The words dissipated like smoke. Still he resolved that tomorrow, when the presses rolled again with their embellished tales, he would begin tracing not the headlines, but the footnotes, the overlooked details that gossip never bothered to polish. For there, amid the noise of rumor, the truth often waited, quiet and persistent, like the steady flow of the Seine beneath its fog. The telegram from Moulin had been answered, and though the commissaire's reply contained only the usual formalities, there was enough between the lines to send Maigret back onto the rails. He boarded the afternoon train south, pipe unlit in his pocket, a newspaper folded without interest on the seat beside him. The carriage swayed steadily as it left Paris behind, and fields unrolled beyond the window in wide sheets of damp earth and hedgerows blurred by drizzle. He dozed in fragments, waking to the rattle of wheels and the occasional cough of another passenger. Each time he woke, the drowned poet returned, not as a corpse, but as a man walking down these very corridors years before, restless, eyes too bright, a satchel of papers pressed against his side. By the time Maigret arrived, dusk had gathered over Moulins, that hour when the town seemed to shrink into itself. The station lamps flickered reluctantly to life, casting halos of pale yellow that trembled in the mist. Steam hissed from the departing engine, rolling low across the platform, blurring the legs of travellers until they appeared like shadows drifting through a dream. He stepped down heavily, overcoat collar raised, his hat brim dripping with condensation. The chill here was different than Paris, less damp, more biting, as though the cold air carried judgment. The station master awaited him once again, his cap pulled firmly down, spectacles clouded by the sudden fog. "Inspector," he said with a nod. "We did what we could. Some here remember him. Some pretend not to. But the name has stirred more than I expected." He gestured toward the square beyond the station, where shop fronts had already pulled their shutters. "The town likes quiet, you see. It doesn't welcome ghosts returned from Paris." Maigret followed at his slow, deliberate pace, his heavy boots echoing on the stone floor of the station, then muffled by the damp gravel outside. The square stood nearly empty, only a boy kicking at a loose cobblestone, and a woman hurrying home with a basket covered by a cloth. Beyond, The narrow streets stretched with the kind of stillness that belonged to provincial towns at dusk, where every sound, closing door, a barking dog, the creak of a sign, seemed to carry twice as far. At a small café near the station, the commissaire of Moulins waited. He was a spare man with a neat beard and eyes that avoided lingering too long. Over glasses of thin red wine, he spoke in the careful tone of one accustomed to both listening and forgetting. Yes, Vautier lived here, if one can call it living. He arrived often from Paris, always with papers, always behind on rent. He kept to himself except when he drank. Then he became impossible, loud, quarrelsome, boasting of genius, but the genius never appeared, only debts. "Enemies?" Maigret asked quietly. Perhaps not enemies, but certainly those who wished him gone, an innkeeper who cursed his name, a bookseller who laughed when he offered verses in payment, and women. There are always women, one in particular, married, a shopkeeper's wife. They whispered, they met by the river until her husband discovered them. Vautier disappeared soon after. The town closed over the scandal like water over a stone. Until now. The commissaire drank, set his glass down firmly. "You see, Inspector, we do not relish his return even in death. He belonged neither here nor in Paris. He lived between places, and such men leave only shadows." Later, alone, Maigret walked through the town. The streets were nearly deserted. Lamps burned behind curtains, casting soft rectangles onto cobblestones slick with mist. He turned toward the river, drawn by the sound of water slipping against its banks. The Allier flowed darkly, quieter than the Seine, its surface broken only by ripples of reflected light. He stood at the bridge, pipe glowing faintly, and thought of the poet meeting a woman here, words whispered in the shadows, promises made, discovered, broken. He imagined the husband's rage, the woman's fear, Vautier's restless flight. All of it dissolved into the stillness of the provincial night, as though the town itself had chosen silence over scandal. At the station the next morning, Maigret returned. He spoke with porters, clerks, vendors. Each gave fragments, a man scribbling at the counter, a quarrel overheard, a satchel dropped in haste, a woman's scarf glimpsed in twilight. The scarf again, always the scarf, dark wool, worn close at the throat, an ordinary object elevated by repetition into symbol. He wrote it in his notebook with the same care as before. One porter recalled something more. "I used to leave letters here, monsieur, not many. Always addressed to Paris, but never with enough postage." We added the difference out of pity. The handwriting was jagged, feverish. Once he sent one to a woman. The envelope smelled of tobacco and wine. The porter shrugged, embarrassed by his memory. "I do not remember her name." By late afternoon, Maigret boarded the return train. The platform stretched before him in the fading light, long and empty, rails gleaming with moisture. He paused, looking back. The station lamps trembled in the dusk, each halo floating like a fragile promise above the platform. A few figures lingered. A mother holding her child, a porter with a lantern, a soldier smoking a cigarette. Each face glanced toward him briefly, then looked away, as though uneasy at the presence of a man carrying Paris into their quiet evening. As the train pulled away, Maigret leaned against the window, watching the station recede, swallowed by mist and distance. He thought of the drowned poet, not as a man in water, but as a traveller pacing that very platform, restless, waiting for a train that never truly took him where he wished to go. The image lingered. A figure in threadbare clothes, satchel clutched, scarf trailing in the wind, eyes searching the dusk for something beyond timetables and tickets. When Paris returned at last with its roar and smoke, Maigret felt the shift in air. Yet the silence of Moulins travelled with him, settling into his thoughts like sediment at the bottom of a glass. The drowned poet's shadow stretched from the Quartier Latin to that provincial station, linking a tub of stagnant water with a scandal whispered by a riverbank, with letters posted in desperation, with a woman's scarf glimpsed both here and there. Back at Quai des Orfèvres, he placed his notebook on the desk, pipe smoke rising steadily. Lucas and Janvier awaited him, their eyes asking before their words. He gave them the facts in his calm, measured tone, but even as he spoke, he knew the case had widened. It was no longer only about a shuttered hotel in Paris. It carried the weight of provinces, of scandal, of rumours revived by newspapers, of silence kept by towns that prefer to forget. The inspector leaned back, his chair creaking, and let the quiet fill the office. Outside, the Seine moved darkly under the bridges, lamps trembling in the mist. He knew that the next step would not be taken in cafes or provincial stations, but in the shadowed spaces where lives intersect, in marriages strained by betrayal, in debts recorded only in memory, in the fragile line between words written and lives lived. For now he let the day close, pipe glowing, his eyes steady on the river beyond the window. The drowned poet had not yet spoken his last word, and Maigret, patient as ever, would wait to hear it in the silence between dusk and dawn. The Seine was restless that night, its surface broken by faint ripples that caught the reflection of lamps and fractured them into trembling shards. From his office at Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret stood at the window, pipe between his teeth, gazing out as if the river itself might yield an answer. Behind him, the silence of the room pressed heavy. Only the steady tick of the clock and the faint hiss of the stove broke it. He had returned from Moulins with the weight of scandal folded into his notebook. A shopkeeper's wife, a jealous husband, whispered meetings by the river. But the facts felt as fragile as smoke. They did not explain the tub of water in a shuttered Paris hotel, nor the missing matchbox, nor the woman with the scarf who threaded her way through testimonies like a half-seen ghost. What struck him now was not the method of Vautier's death, but its meaning. What was the moral weight of this one life, so easily dismissed in cafes, revived in rumour, exaggerated in print? The papers had made him a figure of tragedy or farce, but the reality was more difficult, less palatable. Vautier had been poor, quarrelsome, sometimes drunk, sometimes tender. He had written lines that dissolved into water. He had loved, perhaps clumsily, a woman who had risked more than bread to stand by him. He had been scorned, laughed at, forgotten. And now he was dead. The city, fickle as ever, consumed his story with appetite, but cared little for the man himself. Maigret's own reflection in the glass seemed to merge with the dark water. He remembered other cases, other lives lost. A shopgirl stabbed in jealousy, an old man who hanged himself when debts pressed too close, a boy who stole bread and paid with a beating that stopped his breath. Each life had weighed differently on him, yet none had been without weight. He never allowed himself the illusion that some deaths mattered less than others, though he knew society made that judgment daily. Vautier's life, meagre and ragged as it appeared, had the same stubborn claim on truth as any other. That was why he stood here, pipe embers glowing, listening to the river. In the morning, Paris buzzed louder than ever with the poet's tale. Vendors shouted fragments, clerks carried folded newspapers as though they contained revelations. Students debated lines they had never read. The story had grown so large it threatened to bury the man beneath it. Maigret, walking slowly through the Quartier Latin, felt the eyes of strangers follow him, whispers trailing behind. They knew he was the inspector, and they wanted him to give their rumours weight. He offered nothing, only the steady puff of his pipe, the calm gravity of his silence. At a café on Rue Saint-Séverin, Janvier was waiting. He rose as Maigret entered, his face lined with the fatigue of too many late nights. "Chief," he said, "there's talk of suicide notes. The papers claim he left one. They describe verses on despair, written in his own hand, but we know his notebook was ruined by water." "Which means," Maigret replied, lowering himself heavily into the chair, "that the press invents again, or someone gave them fragments, not everything blurred." He paused, considering. Sometimes invention reveals desire more than fact. They want him to be a tragic figure, but a man's end is rarely so neat. Janvier hesitated. "Do you think he wanted to die?" Maigret drew on his pipe before answering. The smoke curled between them like a veil. "I think he wanted to be seen, whether by death or by verse, I cannot yet say, but wanting to be seen is not the same as wanting to vanish." Later, in his office, Lucas entered with a small bundle of papers. "Recovered from the river," he said. "A rag picker sold them to a bookseller, who recognized the name. They're damp, half illegible, but some lines remain." Maigret spread the sheets on his desk. The ink had bled, but here and there a word survived. Stubborn, fog, river, silence, beyond. He read them slowly, lips moving without sound. They were fragments only, too scattered to prove genius, too desperate to dismiss. Yet they carried the trace of a man's inner voice, struggling against oblivion. He placed them carefully aside, treating them as one might treat relics, not because of their literary value, but because they had been the last thoughts of a life now drowned. In the evening, Madame Maigret set a simple supper on the table: veal stew, carrots, a carafe of red wine. They ate in the quiet rhythm of habit. She listened without pressing as he spoke of the press, of the café, of the papers retrieved from the river. She poured him more wine and said softly, "They all want to make him more than he was. But perhaps being a man, only that, is enough." Her words lingered with him later as he smoked by the open window. Perhaps being a man was enough. And yet, he thought, society rarely agreed. It divided lives into those worth remembering and those meant to vanish without record. His task, perhaps, was to resist that division, to insist that every drowned body, every forgotten poet, deserved the same weight of truth. The next day brought another rumour, this time whispered by a bookseller. "They say his verses were stolen, Inspector, that another poet, one with fame, took them and published them as his own. Vautier quarrelled, threatened to expose him. Perhaps that is why he is dead." The man spoke with relish, eager to embroider the story. Maigret listened, expression unchanged, then walked away. Stolen words again. The quarrel in the café, the accusation shouted at the bearded writer. Could it be more than madness? He filed it quietly in the depths of his mind. Another pebble dropped into the growing pile. That evening, as the fog rolled thick across the river, Maigret sat once more at his desk. The fragments of verse lay beside him, blurred yet insistent. The scarf, the bread, the matchbox, the quarrels, the provincial scandal, the gossip of the press. All these threads tangled together. He could feel the weight of them pressing down, not with the urgency of a crime demanding punishment, but with the quiet insistence of a life that refused to vanish without acknowledgement. He leaned back, pipe glowing faintly, and considered the drowned poet once more. Vautier had been a man of contradictions, proud yet dependent, gifted perhaps yet clumsy, loved yet abandoned. He had lived between Paris and the provinces, between cafes and riverbanks, between notebooks and silence. He had been, in the eyes of many, insignificant. Yet here was the inspector of Quai des Orfèvres, weighing his life with the same gravity as any countess or minister. The moral weight of a single life, Maigret thought, is not measured by its fame or its productivity. It is measured by the simple fact that it existed, that it breathed, that it sought meaning. Vautier had sought meaning in words, in bread, in a woman's scarf, in the turning of a matchbox between his fingers. He had not found it, but he had sought it, and for that alone his death deserved clarity. The inspector exhaled a long plume of smoke, watching it drift toward the ceiling, dissolving like verse into air. He felt the case shifting again, not toward spectacle, but toward its quiet center. Somewhere in the fog of Paris, amid rumor and invention, lay the simple truth of a man who had lived and died. It was enough to carry him forward, step by step, into the final act. The city woke beneath a veil of fog so thick that even the bridges seemed to hover without anchor, their arches dissolving into pale mist. Barges moved slowly, horns muffled, their shapes barely visible. On the quays, men wrapped in scarves appeared like silhouettes cut from grey cloth. It was the kind of morning that belonged to Paris alone, when the Seine seemed less a river than a memory, and when the sound of dripping water carried further than footsteps. Maigret stood at the window of his office at Quai des Orfèvres, pipe clamped firmly, watching as fog seeped into every crevice of the city. It was the same fog that had greeted him on the morning the drowned poet was found. The circle had closed. He turned back to his desk, where the fragments lay. Blurred sheets rescued from the river, a café chit marked with a waiter's cramped initials, a telegram from Moulin's, his own scrawled notes about a woman with dark hair and a scarf. Nothing conclusive. And yet together they formed a picture too consistent to ignore. The woman existed. Whether her name was Claire or another, she had moved through the poet's last days like a shadow tethered to his own. She had brought him bread, paid for his drinks, argued softly in provincial rooms, wept in Parisian cafes. She had shared with him the silence of a hotel locked against the world. And then she had vanished, leaving only her scarf in the memories of others. Lucas entered with his usual unhurried step. He set a small parcel on the desk. "From the lab," he said. Inside lay the matchbox, au phare, with its printed lighthouse still sharp despite water stains. It had been found not in the hotel, but in the pocket of a man picked up for drunkenness near Pont-Neuf, a regular at the café. He had confessed, after some persuasion, that he took it from the shuttered room, curious when the door stood half open one night. He swore he had seen nobody then, only disorder and dampness. The statement was worthless as fact, but the matchbox itself mattered. It proved that others had entered the hotel. The silence of the locked door was not as absolute as it had seemed. "Janvier has something too," Lucas added, "a student from the Sorbonne. He claims he copied some of Vautier's verses long before his death, says they were whispered in cafes, and yesterday in the paper he recognized them, published under another poet's name, a famous one." Stolen words. The quarrel with the bearded man, the rage in the café, the accusations no one believed. Now they surfaced again, given sharper edge by the pages blurred into silence. If true, it meant Vautier had not drowned in despair alone. He had been silenced at the moment his claim might have clawed its way into daylight. Maigret felt the heaviness in his chest, heavier even than the pipe smoke. He did not say the word murder, not yet. But he knew the poet's death bore the imprint of others, whether in action or in neglect. Someone had left him to drown in silence, whether in a tub of water or in the fog of indifference. By evening, the fog deepened. The inspector walked slowly through the streets, his heavy coat beaded with moisture, his hat brim dripping. He paused on Pont Neuf, leaning against the parapet, pipe glowing faintly, and watched the black water slide beneath. A tugboat passed, its horn low and mournful, swallowed almost at once by the mist. He thought of Vautier again, of the fragments of verse, of the desperate need to be seen. And he thought too of the woman, her scarf pulled tight, her eyes filled with fear. She had not reappeared. Perhaps she never would. Perhaps she had returned to Moulins, or, further still, carrying silence as her only protection. At Quai des Orfèvres later that night, he dictated the report. His tone was steady, words plain. The deceased, identified as one Vautier, poet of no fixed address, was discovered in the premises of a disused hotel, Rue des Écoles. Circumstances suggest drowning, though details remain inconclusive. Testimonies point to associates, including a woman whose identity remains uncertain. Rumors of stolen writings cannot be verified. The case, in absence of conclusive evidence, remains unresolved. He set the pen down, stared at the page. It was not the truth, but it was what the file would hold. The truth was heavier, less clear, unfit for paper, that the man had lived between Paris and the provinces, between verse and silence, between bread and hunger, between one woman's pity and a city's indifference. That he had been drowned not only in water but in neglect, in theft, in rumour. That he had carried in his hand, at the very end, a pencil stub like a final weapon. When he closed the file, the weight did not lift. He rose, pulled on his coat, and walked once more into the night. The fog embraced him, clinging to his shoulders, filling the streets with ghostly softness. Lamps glowed faintly, halos trembling. The cafes still buzzed, voices spilling onto the pavements, but to him it was all distant, muted, as though the city itself had joined the fog in refusing to answer. At home, Madame Maigret had left the lamp burning low, supper kept warm on the stove. He ate without appetite, pipe between his teeth, the silence of the room deeper than any testimony. She sat opposite him, mending a seam, her eyes steady on her work, yet aware of the heaviness in his face. When he spoke, it was barely more than a murmur. He was not nothing. She looked up, needle paused in mid-air. "No one is nothing," she said simply. Later, as he lay in bed, he listened to the river through the half-open window. It moved unseen, carrying fog and fragments of light, endless, indifferent. He thought of Vautier's blurred lines, of the words beyond the river fog, and felt a strange kinship. Perhaps the poet had known, in his last moment, that clarity is rare, that truth dissolves as quickly as ink in water. When sleep came, it was heavy, without dreams. The case would not return tomorrow. It would not trouble the presses further. It would slide into silence like so many others. But for Maigret, the drowned poet would remain, a shadow carried quietly in the smoke of his pipe, in the slow steps of his walk, in the fog over the Seine that came and went, yet never entirely lifted. The city would forget. He would not.